I'm going to introduce our moderator. Morgan Reed is the Executive Director of ACT, the App Association, and is a widely respected expert on the intersection of government and technology. And you have quite a few links on C-SPAN, I noticed.
I do.
Going way back.
Yes, I'm old. Thank you for bringing that up.
Not at all.
Just how old I am.
We're all a little older in the tooth. Anyway, I'll just leave it to you, Morgan, to introduce your panel.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you all. Hopefully at this point in time, you've had your food, it's digested, you've seen some amazing things from Lego and Roblox and others. So we're going to give you a little bit of an aperitif, hopefully, a digestive aperitif. Hopefully no one leaves here with an upset stomach. We're going to talk a little bit about the future of online privacy, online safety policy writ large. And it's impossible to do that without really having a full scope of the frame that we're working on. Everything from social media to the international component to what it means in this platform-heavy environment. And so I am incredibly honored to have an amazing panel, and not a manel. By the way, Mr. Balcom, you have done a great job at this conference in ensuring very balanced panels that are not 14 men on stage. Good job. I know we have to laugh about that, but it's just been amazing how the transformation has happened over the years. So well done to FOSI on that. But again, my panelists are that wide range. We have Lauren Culbertson from Twitter, Jennifer Huddleston from the Mercatus Center, Martin Cocker from Netsafe New Zealand, and Natasha Jackson from GSMA. We really do cover the bases, everything from social media to the platforms that make it possible to the academics behind it, and then what do we have to think of from an international component? I think to kick this off, I actually want to think about what are the 4 pillars that we kind of need to think about as we move forward into the future of online safety. Jennifer, where do you see us headed right off the bat? What are the key things that we need to be thinking about as we think about what are the regulatory structures and what's our future on this space?
Thank you, and thank you for moderating this panel. I think it's a really interesting question because, as we heard earlier today, we don't only want to think about the potential harms and dangers that are out there online, we also want to think about the benefits and how technology can really empower parents, families, and children to have new experiences, to connect with new places. So I think it's important to look at the advantages of maintaining a flexible approach that allows different families to find the products and services that are right for them and allows innovators to have relatively low barriers to entry and create those products and services to serve different communities.
Well, I think there's a little bit of overlap from that perspective with you, Natasha. Your members, the participants in that giant audience that shows up at the GSMA conference, how do they see kind of where this framework is? Where do the people who participate there, what are the issues that they're really highlighting?
So we've worked, sorry, for those of you who don't know, the GSMA is the Association for Mobile Operators around the world. And we've worked on online safety for over 10 years now. But we started to change the way we were looking at that in the last few years when we started engaging much more with UNICEF and working with the framework they use, which is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which yesterday celebrated 30 years. And I think when we were looking at that, we had always originally been looking at protection. And now what we were looking at is all of the rights for children and how mobile can enable that, from protection through to participation and the benefits that you were just talking about, whether it's play, education, all those different rights that children have across a whole spectrum of issues are things that mobile technology and digital technologies are enabling with protection at the forefront.
Well, that's an interesting word you chose, which is participation. And Lauren, nobody knows more about participation than Twitter. You are the global participation platform. We're here to talk a little bit about online safety, but from a family perspective. What are the things that you think are really important, and are there anything that you want to highlight that you guys at Twitter are doing from that participation perspective that Natasha just brought up?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me here today. So you might have heard our executives say this, but at Twitter, our purpose is to serve a public, healthy conversation. And what does healthy conversation mean? That actually means making sure that the people who come to Twitter feel safe to do so, and they can also trust the integrity of the information that they're viewing on the platform. And we realize that this is something that our work is never going to be done And it's really important to work with experts, academics, and a lot of the folks who are in this room. So I'm really glad to be here.
Well, Martin, you've been on the side of where there has to be a public-private partnership. So far, we've heard lots of kind of free market perspective, and this can all be handled at the industry level. But for you all in New Zealand, you've had some crises that were that moment where the government and industry has to work together quickly and do take a more appropriate action. How do you see what you've all experienced in New Zealand? How should that be feeding into our discussion around family and safety here and around the world?
Okay, so that's quite a big question. I'll start by
it is.
Start by explaining who Netsafe is. So Netsafe is the online safety NGO of New Zealand. Just to explain who New Zealand is, that's the little country beside Australia, sort of towards America. We are sort of like a full-service online safety agency for New Zealand. So we do education and we do support for people who are being harmed. And we provide policy advice for the government, etc. But we are independent of government. So yes, New Zealand had a crisis, and that forced us to think a lot more about policy and our place in the safety world. And there were probably two main thrusts that we thought about. One was, what do you do outside of jurisdiction? So New Zealand has no jurisdiction over many of the products that New Zealanders use on a daily basis. So how is it that we keep New Zealanders safe on those products? Can't force that. And the second thing, which is fascinating sort of intellectual conversation, is how do you regulate for proactivity rather than reactivity? So I can dig into that a bit later, but that's the other thrust of the work that we've done.
Well, that's a good point. And Jennifer, one of the things that I know we've all heard a lot of panels here talking about COPPA and GDPR and some of the privacy-focused laws, but one of the things that he just mentioned was about participation. One of the things that gets a lot of attention here in the United States is Section 230. I know that this is one of the most educated audiences you're going to find on these issues, but help us kind of frame the 230 up. What is 230, and what does it really mean?
So Section 230 refers to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which was a law passed back at the infancy of the internet in the late 90s. Most of this law most of the Communications Decency Act was struck down as a violation of First Amendment rights by the court, but Section 230 is what remained. And what Section 230 did is it created a law that said online platforms are not liable for user-generated content. In other words, if I go on Twitter and say something, you can sue me as an individual, but you can't necessarily sue Twitter for hosting that information. It largely came out of an earlier court ruling, and it also encouraged platforms to engage in different content moderation standards. And that's another key element that a lot of times gets a little bit neglected in these conversations around online content, is that part of the purpose behind Section 230 was to recognize that different platforms were going to be serving different communities, and so may need to have different standards, and that having a wide variety of standards would help families, help children, help parents find those innovative tools, encourage the development of innovative tools so that they could find the right fit for each of them.
So to offer a little skepticism, I mean, does 230 really work? I mean, do we really see opportunities for 230 to play out? I mean, Twitter, for you guys, Lauren, I'm sorry, you're not Twitter, but for you all, I mean, is 230 really a tool for you, or is it a tool for user-generated content? And Jennifer just raised this concept of moderation. Mm-hmm. How do you guys deal with that question? Because, people just say whatever they want out there.
I'd say it's both, but Section 230 for us is the single most important tool that we have to be proactive in moderating for problematic content. And I think as content, like if you think about the beginnings of social media, a lot of content moderation practices were reactive, right? So someone says something, someone reports it, the platform takes it down. Now we're moving into this space where a lot of what you're seeing that's being removed, problematic content, some of the worst types of content that you can think of, a lot of that's being done through technology, proactively. And so this is so important as we start to move into this kind of new era of how things are going. A stat that just came out in the Twitter Transparency Report, 50% of the accounts that we're actioning that are being in violation of our rules, 50% of that content is being proactively surfaced by technology, meaning instead of having a user report, technology is actively surfacing this problematic, harmful content.
When Lauren, you say technology, you mean that you're doing it algorithmically? You're looking for patterns, kind of like teachers look for plagiarism in papers?
That's correct. We're using a variety of signals to identify that content.
I also, if I can jump in for a second, think it's important to point out that while Section 230 and user-generated content has certainly been part of the story about what has allowed these social media companies to emerge, it also applies to a lot of other things that are used by parents and students on the internet, things like review sites, things like Wikipedia that are actually generated by users and are having user-generated content. So it's a much broader conversation than just Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Well, Lauren, I want to come back to moderation with you at some point here, but I want to give Natasha a chance to talk. 230 is a particularly American concept. GSMA has much more of a global footprint. How do you see this push-pull between the ability for people to say whatever they think at the moment online, that freedom for platforms to allow this to happen, versus kind of how the rest of the world sees the need to create safe environments?
So we're doing a lot of work at the moment in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and also in Asia. And we see like a sort of two-track process going on where we get called in sometimes by governments who want us to come and talk about AI and ethics and those types of issues. And then at the same time, there's another pull from perhaps within the same country to talk about online safety. In places where they don't even have like a helpline for children to call and issues like that. So you get this sort of twin parallel tracks of discussions, one which are right into technology which isn't really being used in that way in a country, and then the basics of online safety not being addressed in many ways at all. And it makes it a very sort of difficult discussion to have on a sort of level basis like you see happening here. There's a lot of misunderstanding and actually a lot of views expressed over young people's use of media, social media and platform by people who aren't engaging with them themselves.
How do you mean?
So, for instance, we were at a session in, well, I won't say the country actually, recently, and somebody was standing up from the government and talking about social media platforms, and then admitted they'd never used one themselves. And that was a government representative. So you have those sorts of things going on, which makes it a completely different conversation here, but when it comes down to regulatory proposals, they're there ready to put them in.
Well, that's interesting, because Martin, for you all, one of the things that I always have to remind people of, the adoption of mobile devices, smartphones, is the fastest adopted technology in the history of humankind. The adoption rate on mobile phones is faster than fire, the wheel, and interestingly enough, the next physical thing that was a rapid adoption was the microwave. Mobile phone adoption rates are so much higher than any other physical thing we've ever seen that it does make for some moments like what Natasha just described. But then, Martin, for New Zealand, how do you get your hands around that? This explosion of technology, the democratization of being able to take pictures and videos and send them to anyone at any time, regardless of the appropriateness. You've had to work with these social media platforms Natasha described, as you said, from a non-governmental perspective. What do you think the right boundaries are? What are the pillars? What should we be thinking about as we ask questions of the world's fastest adopted technology?
Again, that's a multi-parted question,
Yep.
So I'm just going to answer the bits I feel like.
Perfect. That's the point of panels.
So I agree, like obviously that technology was adopted very, very quickly. Now in New Zealand, you've got basically saturation of internet and mobile phones, so we've got to that point. We did work with the multinationals in a different way than many countries approach the problem. So we developed a piece of law. It's called the Harmful Digital Communications Act. It's from 2015, so it's not very old. But in the act, it deliberately made a producer of a content the first point of liability, but it did also accept that content hosts had some liability as a sort of a second level. So a person produces a content, and it's on Twitter and we want to get it taken down, the person who's responsible for taking it down is the person who produced it, but in the event that that fails, then we turn to Twitter. The government recognized straight away that that was going to be a problem because we don't have jurisdiction over Twitter or any of the American-based organizations, and so it said to Netsafe at the time, we want you to develop relationships that facilitate this happening voluntarily. And so they gave us the resources to do that, and we're getting very high rates of voluntary compliance. Just to come back to the Article 230, the American thing that I always get quite a little bit wrong, there's a big difference between an ISP. There's a big difference between AT&T up there and Twitter, or AT&T and Facebook. And if you treat them like they're the same thing and you give them the same level of protection, that's a nonsense. And it became a much bigger nonsense when algorithms started presenting content to users. Because although those are algorithms, that is a machine making a choice about serving you content. And so at that point, you can't say, we're not at all responsible for the content. You are responsible for the content. And it got put to the test for New Zealand in a big way when the Christchurch attacker produced a video, and that video got served to users because an algorithm saw the video was popular. And so at that point, you can't say it's user-generated content, the users are responsible, you're responsible for what you picked. The algorithm was serving that content to people, so therefore there's got to be some appropriate liability back to the hosts.
Well, Jennifer, that's an interesting point he raises. As a recovering programmer, I understand. At some point, somebody has to type the code in, but there is some level of responsibility on how you train your algorithms, what you select for, the thing that you push for. What do you think about Martin's point about, look, there's some level of responsibility. You can't just blame it all on the code.
I think one of the interesting things when you're talking about content moderation, particularly at scale, is a lot of times you have kind of a moderator's dilemma when you don't have any kind of liability protection. So it leaves companies between a rock and a hard place, in that either they feel they have to allow everything and say, enter at your own as kind of no lifeguard on duty, or that the minute anything becomes slightly controversial, that they have to take it down. Now, there are some things that I think many people would generally agree need to be taken down, and what we've seen is in those cases, the advantage is that innovation has been developing tools to assist companies to take down those truly harmful and damaging events. On the other hand, there's a lot of gray areas where different companies and different individuals may have different opinions on where exactly to draw that line. And ideally, under the American approach to this, you have a variety of options.
Although, Natasha, it's really interesting that you're working in sub-Saharan Africa, because as Jennifer just kind of outlined it, well, we have this cultural perspective, things that we, quote, all agree to. Around the world, that's not always true. Other countries have very wildly different perspectives as to what, quote, everyone agrees to that should be removed. What have you guys been thinking about as you've been, what is it, your Y-Power, I'll get the name wrong. Empower. Empower for Youth activity. How do you approach what Jennifer just outlined on some of those questions?
Well, Empower Youth, we use this UN framework that I've talked about on that, and even just the word rights, because it's the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, has different sort of perceptions in different countries. So we found that underlying the issues that we're working on, the sorts of things we're talking about when you put it into use cases of being able to get education into refugee camps for children, using mobile technology, or being able to register a child's birth and having a birth certificate enabled by mobile. When you start to talk about use cases, people get it. But when you talk otherwise at sort of a higher level, then people are interpreting things very differently. But there is quite a lot of commonality when you get into the use cases and the examples of what technology is doing.
Interesting. So, Lauren, she's kind of describing a place where the use case matters the most. I know one of the areas that has been interesting from Twitter's perspective is I put something out there and then other people kind of fire back at me and I'm kind of exposed. What are the things that Twitter can do to help me have more ownership, more control over what's being done to me as well? I mean, I know we'll always get ratioed, but how does it work? What are you guys thinking about when it comes to this concept?
So we're constantly thinking about how we can give users more control over what they see and how they experience Twitter, as well as how we can bake transparency into that process. So actually, it's very timely that you mentioned this. I think it was today or yesterday, we just rolled out author-moderated controls where you can, if you tweet and people reply to that tweet, you can actually hide those replies, and those will be behind an interstitial, and it'll be transparent as to what action you took, but it takes that content from being displayed out there in the open.
So, but that raises an interesting point from what Martin was saying, which is when something's being surfaced algorithmically, and let's face it, part of why things are surfaced algorithmically is it's more likely to lead to someone viewing an advertisement. How do you see, as we move to this moderation stage, Martin, you know, I think you heard everybody here is looking to do the right thing, but how do we deal with the fact that there's, you can see how algorithms can run amok on these choices because there's an advantage to showing something that everybody, quote, wants to see. What do you think, what did you guys find as you walked through that, as you said, where these images were being shown not by people posting them, but by algorithmic processes?
The first thing I'd say is that Facebook, Google, Twitter, they all wanted to solve the problem. So it's really important, you know, they're often the people who are here in the room at these kinds of events. They're often the ones that get called out.
Literally, yeah.
But they were the companies that they were on the phone. They were the ones standing up resources. They were the ones trying to solve the problem. So there was a whole other internet that wasn't trying to solve the problem. In fact, they were trying to make the problem worse. What we have seen in terms of, and so we're talking in this particular case about extreme content that pretty much everybody, well, anybody I've ever talked to says that doesn't belong in front of anybody on the internet, and we want to see it gone. We're comfortable with that. You know, we've got some interesting statistics about the kind of evolution of that response. So Facebook released these stats publicly, so I can talk about them. But on the first day, that video, there were 1.5 million attempted uploads to Facebook of the live stream video. 1.2 million of them are blocked by AI. 300,000 get through. That's 20% on day one. Over the life of that video, 4.5 million attempted uploads, 97% detected by AI. So the increased use of AI and the improvements in AI over a literally 4 or 5 week period led to a huge reduction in the amount of that content successfully uploaded. So there's no question that, we talked about AI this morning, there's no question that AI and machine learning is the answer to this problem. We're seeing from the stats that are being released by people like Twitter, a surge in the effectiveness of that AI. And then it's just, what we need to do, of course, for organizations like Netsafe, is supplement that with the public reporting what it is that escapes through that AI net. But, I mean, we've seen real successes in the last few months, so I'm optimistic about the continuation of that.
Yeah, and we were happy to join on the Christchurch call, and at UNGA a few months ago, we added a
Tell people what UNGA is.
the UN General Assembly. Sorry about that. DC happens. But we added a fourth pillar to our commitment, and that is crisis response. And that's working across industry to make sure that we're better coordinated and have better technological tools to address things that happen, like what we saw in New Zealand.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I've skipped over it, and my Prime Minister will be filthy with me for doing it. One of the things that when we realised that we had no jurisdictional ability to force change, the Prime Minister took a completely different tack and put out a voluntary call, the Christchurch call, and said to other countries and the tech industry, will you come and be part of this voluntarily? And the Christchurch call has all of the major tech platforms for New Zealanders, and it has 40-odd countries. And it's, you know, it's an entirely voluntary thing, but for a country like New Zealand, that's our option. You know, we can ask people to come and work with us. We can't force them to, and that particular approach has been very successful, in part due to the energy of the Prime Minister, of course.
So Jennifer, your literal job is to think, think tank. So what do you think? What are the lessons learned about the way that, as Martin was describing, they had no power, and so they used the power of they had no legislative power, but they used the power of phone calls and call to action to effectuate a policy change that went along. Where do you think that sits on the continuum? Do you think that's something that needs to be thought of more globally? What do you all think there at a think tank?
So this is my individual opinion, I should say. I think as a scholar, what you see there is that oftentimes these tools are developed because of a recognition that they want to solve this problem for the market. It's not necessarily a regulation that can have an adverse effect on legitimate speech, but instead a desire to create a product that people would want to be on.
And so you think that really, I mean, the thing to look at it is use the standard kind of concept of market forces. Look, this is something that companies want. It's an outcome that they want to see. It'll make their users happy, so go with it.
Well, at the same time, though, what that actually looks like may vary from company to company because how they encounter different content may vary from company to company. So rather than dictating a specific set of standards that only allows technology to operate in one way and prevents new innovative ideas that may be able to improve AI or come up with a better system of catching these concerning incidents. You don't want to lock in the existing form and assume it's the best that we can ever have. You want to have a flexible approach that allows better options to develop as well.
Well, one of the things, though, we keep kind of skirting around, we've been talking a lot about safety and like response to in this case, a horrific violent crime. But we also have privacy laws and some very different perspectives on how we get there. Natasha, you guys have worked, you have that international framework, so GDPR hit you guys before it hit the rest of us, although it hit everybody at the same time. How does that fit in? Because I think, some of what Jennifer alluded to, people have different perspectives on what it means. The United States perspective on privacy is a little different than Europe. How do we fit that into this broad concept of online safety?
So we're seeing the effect of the GDPR is just going sort of all around the world. I mean, we worked on the GDPR for 8 years before it actually came into effect in Europe. So it was a long process there, but the impact that it had once it was in place was, the phones and, the emails started coming in from all parts of the world who were looking at that and thinking, what does that mean for my country? What parts of that might I adopt? Does it inspire me? So the level of discussion that we've seen around the world has just gone through the roof on privacy. I wouldn't say that it has gone through the roof on children's privacy. I've heard more about children's privacy here today than I've heard in many other countries. But there has certainly, but it's certainly enabling those conversations more. And what we've been doing is bringing together the different sort of regulatory bodies who work on all sort of aspects of this together. So bringing together from our side the telecoms regulators in some countries with the data protection authorities, and then sometimes with the Ministry of Children or Families together to have a discussion about where the intersection of those things is. And what we found is that in many countries, they've never actually met each other, even though they're from the same country. And I think it's the enablement of those sorts of discussions that's really starting to happen and needs to happen more.
Right. So, Lauren, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit on this one. If you heard what Natasha said, she said, people are looking at implementing versions of GDPR. A company like Twitter has the economic wherewithal to comply with every slight tweak of GDPR around the world. But the internet's a global place. I know that you guys will, of course, I can say it for you, you look forward to complying with every country's privacy law. But does it create conundrums when you're trying to figure out how do I meet EU GDPR and then India's tweak on GDPR and then Bangladesh's slight switch on that and then the addition in Venezuela and Brazil and everybody's slight tweak?
Of course. I mean, as you know, we believe at Twitter, privacy is a human right. And so we think that everybody should be afforded that right. I do think that it is beneficial to have national or global standards around that. I'm sure Jennifer can talk to some of the clashes between US law and GDPR when it comes to things like the First Amendment, but that's where we find ourselves here.
Well, Jennifer, Lauren just handed you the torch, so the moderator, Lauren, has suggested a question to you. No, it's perfect.
Well, I think it's interesting because, of course, talking about children's privacy, I mean, some of us were having a discussion earlier. One of the interesting things with GDPR is at times it's actually required more data collection because of age verification requirements and different ages in different countries. And so if you're a global company or even just an EU-wide company, you may be trying to comply with several different standards. And sometimes you may be able to just pick one, and other times you may have to have specific products, or you may choose to pull your product from children altogether. And in some cases, we did see some companies, not necessarily over that particular issue, but pull out of the EU altogether because of the cost and burdens related to GDPR compliance. In the US, there still is a lot of debate over what a federal privacy framework would look like, whether or not it is, and there's a need for a federal privacy framework. We've seen some states go ahead and act in terms of California and the California Consumer Privacy Act. We also have those seen previous existing laws. We've heard about COPPA today when it comes to children. There are certainly other laws governing financial information, governing health information that apply to specific sectors of information. At the same time, whenever we're looking at privacy in the US, it's also important to look at what else may be impacted by that. Certainly, we can see where someone might be harmed from certain information, but we also have a robust tradition of free speech. And so what is that impact on potential speech rights? What is the impact on innovation and potential other benefits that could actually give us better privacy and security? What is the impact on data collection and data security and existing players and the size of companies? All these other concerns become interplayed, and so I think oftentimes it's hard to just pick one and without considering its impact on the others.
Well, I'm going to give the room a little freedom of speech here for a moment. We're going to go to questions, but the first thing I want to do is do a little polling. Jennifer brought up a hilarious thing, which is the thought of the United States actually passing comprehensive privacy legislation. We are fully for it, but I want a show of hands, no embarrassment, you can hide your eyes if you want to. How many of you think that we will have comprehensive privacy legislation in the United States by the end of next year? Ouch. How many of you think we'll have comprehensive privacy legislation within 5 years? What do you think, 30%? 30%. How many think that we will never have comprehensive privacy legislation in the United States? About 30%, about 20%. How many of you think that California will become the de facto standard for the United States? Show of hands. Okay, that's the largest single thing that polled on that question. So that tells you a lot about where we think the federal government can do, or more importantly, not accomplish. So with that, I want the audience to start accomplishing some things, which is asking us some great questions. Stephen, where is the mic? Who has the microphone? Raise your hand. Literally nobody has any questions.
I can fill the time by taking a pop at privacy commissioners around the world, if you like. Privacy is definitely having its moment. You know, you're seeing that it's the issue that is dominating the wider safety space. You're seeing a surge in safety initiatives and privacy initiatives and privacy regulations and more resources for privacy off the back of a few years of bad privacy news. And I think this is we're having like a privacy surge. I can tell you that from a country like New Zealand, all this competition for who's got the fanciest privacy legislation is not ultimately that helpful. And we're going to enter it. We're going to update our privacy law this year, and we're going to exert, as it currently stands, extraterritorial ability with that law, which then means we're basically saying our privacy law will compete with yours, and it's a messy situation.
That's a way to put it. What do you think, Jennifer? Well, do we really have no questions in this august audience? Okay, we've got some brave soul. I think
there's a microphone coming.
Right behind you.
Hi. My name is Amitabh, and I'm from India. And this question is what you were discussing earlier regarding governments.
Right.
Because especially from India, the example that you gave, that it could be that the legislature has actually never used the platforms. So when we are looking into data privacy, who are we focusing on? Is it the citizen, or is it like the legislation is going in India right now? And probably, Lauren, you're in a good place to answer it from Twitter's perspective, that what do you do when the government is asking for everybody's data, but the civil society is saying, no, please keep it private? How does a platform negotiate it? Because the example that Martin gave was a very positive one, where the government called and people collaborated. But there are governments like mine where a lot of civil society will say, hey, please don't collaborate with them. because this is the only free space we have to work. So how
is
do
a
you
great
navigate
question.
it?
Okay, so let me make sure I have this straight. Because we were talking about some of the information sharing that was taking place around Christchurch. So I think at Twitter, it's important to differentiate. Twitter by nature is very open and public. When you go to tweet, you're going to share something with the world. And so that information is public information. But what we have behind your account, for example, your IP address, your email address, your phone number, that's private information. We never share that with anyone unless it's law enforcement with proper legal process. And so that's how we differentiate that data. And so that's how we address those certain types of requests.
I also think it's important to point out that this, to the point of privacy having a moment, privacy is not in and of itself a single-sided issue. There are many different issues at play here, whether it's concerns about an individual's control and the options that are available, where we probably, everyone in this room has different preferences, and it may depend on the day what exactly those preferences are and how you choose to, who you choose to share what information with, and what site you trust and don't trust, and what age you give your child free reign, you know, within the legal realm. On the other hand, there's also another privacy question of what information should government have? How accessible should that information be? When should government be able to access this information from these companies? And oftentimes when we just talk about privacy, we talk about it as if it's one single idea, when in reality there's several different policy issues at play.
Yeah, for example, if you tweet out your home address, what should we do with that, right? A lot of people have a lot of different answers for that, or different preferences. And so I think there are a lot of questions that need to be answered.
But what if I tweet out your home address, if I dox you?
Well, we have rules against doxing, so we would take that.
So right, so that becomes, but I think it does get to a larger question here, which is one of the things that's discussed a lot within the context of family safety is the right to be forgotten, the right to make a mistake and not have it be something, or be somewhere and not have it reflect badly on you. And as the questioner asked, if a government says, well, I want to know everybody was at this public square when there was a protest on, how do you deal with those kinds of questions when a lawful order comes, you give all of that information over? That person might have just been walking through on their way to lunch, but they've been caught up in something larger. I think those are questions that I know are going to confound civil society in a large way. I don't want to put you on the spot, Natasha, but GSMA kind of lives in that world of multiple languages, multiple countries, multiple locations.
Yeah, and I mean, just thinking about that, one of the things that we've been asked about and that's coming along is identity systems that may be government applied identity. I know there is one Aadhaar in India, but I don't mean specifically about that, but there are other countries who are looking at having national identity systems using blockchain. Now that is, you know, you're not able to erase the data that is on there. Once it's in blockchain, it's there, it's sort of immovable. And so I think there are just more and more complex questions coming up, and there'll be newer technologies coming in that will make it more complex.
So those of you who are missing that square on your tech buzzword bingo can now fill in blockchain. And last but not least, I want to open it for one more audience question.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the extraterritorial efforts going on. I have a question maybe for all of us. How can we use efforts like that to actually take back our privacy and our lives from companies who actually make their money off of our engagement, enragement, and sharing of our data? The reality is we've got companies that are, in a sense, more powerful than our governments. How can we actually use those tools to actually get back to a world where we can actually live our lives?
Well, they're certainly more powerful than my government. So, in effect, I understand it was a Google employee that told me this, but Google's earnings are the same as New Zealand's GDP, so approximately the same size. I think that the lesson from Christchurch was like a country like New Zealand is used to being a small country dealing with other bigger countries and being part of a international network where it has to deal with the fact that it's a small player with a limited amount of influence. And so it uses those same tools of diplomacy, of network building that have been developed between countries as international. So the same kind of approach we would take with to international diplomacy, but we're taking it with multinational IT organizations. And I don't think it's a perfect solution. I think when you don't have a perfect solution, you look for the best imperfect solution, and I think that approach is the best imperfect solution.
Well, in the interest of time, does anybody have anything that I left on the table that you wanted to get out? We've literally circled the globe twice. We've got Africa, New Zealand, America, Europe. Is there anything that we've left on the table? Jennifer?
I think we've tried to cover as many things as we could.
All right. On that note, I want you all to thank our amazing panelists for the wide-ranging conversation. Thank you very much. And I turn it back over